So when we're talking about music,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like we're talking about practice, and when we're talking about practice, the musician may understand that we're also talking about the music here. Can you comment on that?
Always, both what the musical practice is and what the practice of life is at the same time. Right?
So, I guess then, with that being said, relative to music, does it matter what you eat? Does it matter what you take in?
Of course, everything matters then. Right? Culture matters. The world matters as far as it being a predominating influence in anybody's case. Listening to other music is maybe a useful influence for some people, and beyond the point, can be useless. Really depends on where you are and what the sound is already doing with you. Mm-hmm. So then it's not just about music, it's really about those people who are evolved to a point where yoga becomes a part of their practice, where they're watching their breathing, they're watching their diet, they're watching their sexual neuroses, they're watching their psychoneuroses, all of those things that, say, are damaged by a certain kind of cultural experience. Mm. And people are confused by it at the same time. Right. So when we're talking about the yoga side of it, people who are, let's say, involved in the yoga side, who happen to be musicians, then they are in a process, or they should be in a process of simplifying their lives and getting, to some degree, in touch with what is real for them, emotionally, mentally, physically real. So it's a purificational process then. And it's also a self-realizational process. Could it produce very good music? It's possible. It depends on the musical karma of the individual, not any more than that. So, one of the methods I used when I was younger was fasting. I don't recommend that to many people unless it's done scientifically. It can be, let's say, extreme for some. So you need to know what you're doing, and you need to know that your body and your mind can handle it. Right? Because you're talking about altering your consciousness to a certain degree. After 3 days of fasting, you might start to lose the need, you perceive it, a need for food. And certainly by the 7th day of fasting, if we're talking about a liquid or water fast, as I was used to. So, and then your hearing changes when you get to that place, which is what is beautiful about the fasting. Your hearing changes. So you enter a different sonic zone after you're fasting for a while. So, and that's what you want to test as a practitioner, as a musician, what the changes are that you experience when you deprive the body, which is a native culture practice, ancient, let's say, practice. Deprivation as a form of sacred sensing, see, purificationally speaking. Well, you hear differently, you start to see differently, you start to be different. Comment. So yoga is definitely part of this extreme path, but it doesn't have to be extreme. I don't recommend you go extreme. You want to be very balanced about it and correct about it and be scientific about it.
So it seems like extremeness is also...
That's relative.
Yeah,
it's relative.
It's frequently brought up here. At what times should a practitioner seek out the extreme, and at what times should there be a more
Well, we don't
conscious
say there's any
balance?
time for it to be sought out. That's not prescribed to anybody. I mean, people are just extreme, or they're not. This is for those who know they better be extreme for what it is they want to do, depending on what that is. Okay? So there's no recommendation, be extreme. No, it's about extreme mastery. That means there's an element of mercilessness there relative to your programming, right? It's more like what I remember in the military, when I was in the military, right? Ranger training, right? Some would call it commando training. It's part of the airborne ranger training regiment, which is test yourself. Right. And so that's a purification process, pushing your limits. And that's what I've applied to my music, pushing the limits. You know? And so I think that we have a right to do that. Otherwise, what is the alternative? It would seem to be then a certain kind of agreement to mediocrity, which I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in the mediocrity of what everybody else is doing or what they've done. I'm interested in pushing myself to the limits and helping people understand that that's okay too. So when they hear the music, it's a little longer than most people are used to, or as I've heard, it's too extreme, relatively speaking, for some people. But it has a place. Coltrane was relatively extreme. Elvin Jones was relatively extreme. Same with Rashid. McCoy Tyner was pushed. Thank heavens these guys were pushed, and they had somebody pushing them to a certain degree. See, outside of their own, let's say, tendency to be normal or mediocre. Come in. So that's an individual choice. Nobody's recommending that you do that, but some people have to do that, and there's no question about it. They don't feel right. They don't feel right unless they do that.
For certain people with extreme tendencies, maybe
we're talking about positive extreme tendencies. We're talking about yogically extreme tendencies, with the idea of loving kindness is at the base of that. So to be a better person, be kind, learning how to take advantage of a yogic process that enables you to, let's say, correctly approach your mental neuroses and your emotional neuroses. See? And of course your physical neuroses. All of these are forms of or levels of diseases that we need to check, right? Get help to more or less heal. But I'm talking about yoga then as a primary form of self-healing practice. Becoming a yogi. A sound yogi, even better. Come in. Yeah, speaking of self-healing through yogic practice, appropriate, right, wise and sacred yoga practice, right, healing, right. We're talking about a sane approach to not so much extreme practice. I think that could be misleading to people, but it's relative, But we're talking about not being too comfortable, but opening oneself to the possibility that they may not be working on all their given cylinders, so they need to test and prove it to themselves. So fasting is one way of doing that. Eat less. See how you feel. The idea is to gain energy from it, not to waste yourself. See, when I would tell people when I was playing back in the days, in let's say 70s, that I had more energy when I fasted. I could be fasting for 7-10 days, and I'm playing like a demon. See, that's because my body had then entered a resonance with the light as the light, and that's the sound of light, the light of sound. See? And so doing breathing exercises was very important during that period. Pranayama, as it's called, breath control. And that's, for an average person, maybe extreme. But it's not. It's basic yoga. See? And its purpose is to calm your brain. See? And naturally and subsequently, the body-mind settles in. You start breathing. So it's breath control and sound control. This is good practice for any musician and anyone who wants to go the yogic path of purification. And let's say, I'm not going to say extreme, but just yoga practice.
And it seems like there are also, for a practitioner, limits that they don't that they don't know are there, or that they might misunderstand or misjudge, but where.
And let me bring this back to another level of sanity. We're talking about what the musician, right, the aspiring, self-disciplined musician, let's say, even professional musicians, is trying to develop in their own case, right? Which I'm not going to sort of assert what that could be for anybody. Right? I was fortunate enough to play with very long-winded musicians. And so the recordings speak for themselves. These are guys like Nigerian drummers, man, runners, who go the distance. Right? And that's a genetic thing, perhaps, or whatever. But I think the long-winded stuff is good for me. Short stuff, no problem. A few minutes of guitar playing, sounding nice and pretty, I think is useful. It's nice. It's okay. But there's much more beyond that, if you ask me. And that is just as important to add to the, let's say the history of the instrument and the history of the music. And that's what I've set out to do. So, showing that there's more if we trust that we are more. Or we can do more. And that there are no limits. You've heard that. You've heard all the creative people say the same thing about that. There are no limits. Don't limit yourself, and there won't be any limits. So, and be careful. Be, again, sane in your developmental process. Sane. So you're healing yourself, not killing yourself.
So there is then extreme practice, which you've just described in some detail.
I'm thinking in terms of musical practice.
Okay.
Yeah.
And for somebody with those types of tendencies, that's very normal, to explore the depths of their
so
potential.
Granted, there are tendencies, but then there's a creative force. So you have certain tendencies, but they may not equal the creative force. No. All you have to do is look into the field of music and you see what I'm talking about. If you care to, and you look at the jazz or the Superman, right? Superman. Or the extreme of the extreme. Jazz. No limits, just your imagination and whatever inherent powers you have. You work from there. So we're talking about creative need is another thing. Then let's say the search for the extreme, which may be nonsense. So we need to know what we're talking about. So you got to come back to sanity and psychological balancement, and not self-abuse. So we have to be mindful of what is self-abuse and then what other people think is self-abuse. So you're not drinking enough water, you're not drinking enough food, so you're abusing yourself. I'm going to call your doctor and so on and so forth. No, the whole approach to yoga is really a Hindu culture practice. And so it's not for everybody. And yoga, as we know, branches off into so many different sort of options. Right? Jnana, bhakti, raja, hatha, yoga, Shabd yoga. So you have all of these different options, right, for different types of people. And no one is suggesting that you should be extreme. You just want to get outside of your, let's say, suffering of your condition or state of mediocrity and go deeper. I recommend people go deeper, wisely and healthfully, right, to see what they need as their next step. Could be marriage, could be divorce, could be any number of things. Having kids, getting rid of kids. Yeah, and so these are different options that are before everybody. You need to know what you need, and then ask others. So ask around and see who has an answer for you. That's what's going on here. So you come to hear a different angle, or maybe shed some light on various aspects of life, practice, and in this case, music. Right? A form of yoga music, let's say. And jazz, in this case, right? Also known as jazz. Some would say it's avant-garde jazz, some would say it's healing jazz, some would say it's spiritual jazz. So, you have various terminologies and schools of thought on it. So in this case, there's been a jazz musical evolution, creative jazz musical evolution. And that coincides with yoga practice, basic yoga practice. Yeah. I'm not recommending that to anyone. I'm saying, if you ask me, that is what I have taken on as an ordeal to find a more subtler approach to using sound and musical structure. Well, doing away with it altogether. So when we're doing yoga exercises, particularly in terms of breathing, then that changes your sense of space, your sense of time. So it alters your energy to a certain degree. It spaces you out, it relaxes you, it opens you up. And that's precisely what yoga is about, calming your nervous system, making you seemingly more open, more relaxed. Yeah. And then they can add to it, well, when you're in that state, from a psychological viewpoint, then there may be more creativity available to you. See, when you're more receptive to the inner, right, deeper psychologic karma that you may have inherited through the blood or picked up along the way, then that might produce positive results relative to your musical expression. We don't know that. So for the most part, your musical expression should be directly related to your emotions and what you need to express to heal yourself. Mostly, not just express to dump on other people necessarily, but what you need to let out that heals you, makes you feel more, let's say, human. Okay with yourself, and so on. And so, of course, there are many different psychologies, right, and techniques, affirmational techniques that are out there, and people explore to the infinite. And you have your religious stuff, various schools, Christian therapy, and religious therapy in general. They're all healings for different people. Spiritual therapies, let's say. And that means how you relate to what spirit is, as something bigger or larger than yourself. See? Or even from a universal viewpoint. See? What is it that we try to connect with that enables us to feel the higher purpose? See? For many people, music is meditation and meditative in nature. Listening, hearing, then feeling emotions. Sound, let's say, creating feelings. Feeling, you can play an instrument, it's completely natural to relate to that feeling. Allow the feeling to come through. Blues, right? Classical form of music, right? The blues form. And throughout the world, there are many different species of, say, minor to major, tonalities and harmonies and so on that express the blues or heart suffering or bliss of human nature. And so when you asked earlier about discipline, depends on your urge to create and hear and manifest what you're hearing and feeling. And that's basically where I come from at the core. So, primal feeling. Not thought, not analysis and all the rest of this. No, this is first and foremost. So stemming directly from the drums and the drum feeling and the drum power. Yeah. And so everyone is different in that way. But we all have to come back to the center. See? And whether or not you're true to your inner voice or your true tone, whatever that might be. Your true song, whatever that might be. And so in my case, I have been true to that. And so I offer that music to everybody to enjoy and listen to or throw away. As irrelevant for them, which is perfect.
It seems like when you were saying you've been true to your tone, your purpose, that
That means that has to become obvious to you. It's not something you pick up at school necessarily. You could pick it up anywhere, but we're talking about what is obvious to the individual.
and it seems like being true may be a way to describe discipline. I think that there may be a variety of definitions.
Or describe a more than a need, let's say, to learn about, but a need to express. Say. So, in other words, going back to my original school, like drumming, there's a need to play certain rhythms, and we have to feel them. We have to know what they are, and these rhythms are like a code, right? Let's say rhythm, time is code. Melody is also code. The harmony is also code, right? For some people, interpreted differently. Some people hear a drum pattern, whatever it might be, and they have to dance. They have to get up. They feel it directly relates to physical action. And some will hear the same drum pattern and feel it's an emotional thing. They start to cry because they hear something. And the drum pattern as code associates, for them, something emotional from the past, let's say. It relates to something tragic, say it's sorrowful, grief, or whatever. Each one is different. And that's what we need to be perceiving for ourselves as individuals. Practicing individuals and evolving musical individuals. We have to know what seems to be working for us and understand it as something which, from this viewpoint, the teachings here, is a step on the path. Everything is a step on the path. That means it arises and then somewhere along the line it disappears. And it should be allowed to disappear in order to refresh or reinvigorate, let's say, the wellspring of a creative power. And so then, talking about discipline, well, yeah, that sounds like something you do. This is before that. This is like prior to you doing the discipline. This is prior to that. Say, come in. I was always working from the prior. Yeah. So I have a different sense of relating to what jazz musicians do. And it's very compatible with them. But it's not about jazz as a language particularly. It's not about that. I'm a drummer first. So I'm already in the primordial soup of rhythmic infiniteness.
Is that the prior that you're talking about?
Related to it. Right, prior. So everything I do is relative to what is prior, to the form of the self being involved in it. So then from that place there is no self. It's always the prior condition, which is a radical viewpoint for some. Prior condition. That means no culture. Right? It's prior to culture. It's primordial. Sorry. Or not. So the conversation about prior karma, right, coming through the genes in terms of my father being a drummer, and of course that was my first addiction, let's say, drums. So, well, I guess you might say problem, right? The fever, drum fever, I called it aptly, right? And it's a madness. It's a form of madness. Yeah. And this is as a child, I was like having to play and move my arms. I mean, it was a drum fever for a child, you know. My mother says by the time I'm 2, it was evident to her that there was something wrong, right? There was a certain kind of obvious obsession at that point, and that's the genes or the karma or the drum fever using me as they may have used my father. See? And so this is musical process, a passing and a genetic, let's say, a tendency, programming. It's there, and it's what I'm saying is that it's automatic. It has its own world, its own life. There's no volitional things going on. There's the madness. And so I was given that, and I had to use it, and I'm still with it, but it's different now. Say. And so this is what we're talking about regarding music is self-developmental stuff, ordinarily, where you don't have the fever, right? You may have an interest in an attraction, and maybe a need for the instrument, whatever it might be, but it may not be something burning in the way, you know. Let's say a madness would be for some. Maybe that's true for some. They have to do it, and nobody else and nothing else is more important than this fever. Yeah, this, I guess you might say, obsession or fixation, maybe both. It's more than compulsive. It's just the real. That's all there is. Yeah. So you have a comment on that?
So that seems like it would be a form of balance for those people, like to express that, to let that go, to release it.
Maybe not. It's hard to say, because you have musicians that kill themselves. And so we would be hard pressed to consider what the balance is there, obviously, what it was, or the imbalance was with it. See, so we're talking about the imbalance that needs to be balanced. Right? So we're not sure that there's balance when we're talking about some of the artists that passed away. You wonder who was a real human and who was just a musician. Yeah. And we see that in music, and especially relative to jazz. And who's a human? Who's a savage? Who's the animal? Was there enough training for the human to show up, or was it all musical training and then something else shows up? Or serious neuroses and deviation and so on and so forth. So it's just part of the balance then. So comment. That's why I say what I recommend people can look into is a yoga to start to correct some of the neuroses that is inherited through the blood. In terms of obsessiveness and a sickness.
And in this, you're using today human in an interesting way. Can you explain what you mean by human when you use it today?
Human in a sense where you have a healthy sense of kindness and self-respect and respect for others. And so you have a wholesome sense of reality. Maybe that's a high standard in this age. Human kindness, respect. And while I do recommend that people look into yoga for themselves, drumming itself is a yoga, and I highly recommend drumming for everybody. Come to terms with the drummer in you. Please come to find out what that beauty is and what that gift is for yourself.